Well, let's start with the war in Ukraine. Over the past few hours, Ukraine and NATO forces have unleashed hell on Donetsk, People's Republic, using American weapons, as confirmed on the ground. American forces are now confirmed, even though something we've been reporting here on the show for many, many months. According to the Washington Post, the Associated Press, and Pentagon officials saying the U.S. troops are monitoring NATO arms deliveries, which is interesting. It seems like things are getting much worse, even though we were hoping for peace talks. But it doesn't seem like we're going to get those anytime soon. For more on this, we'd like to bring in Colonel Douglas MacGregor to help us cut through this fog of war. Colonel, you've been spot on in your assessments of what is about to unfold. And it seems over the past 48 hours, things have gotten very bizarre. Can you help us cut through some of the disinformation that's floating around out there? What is the truth at this hour?
Well, admittedly, the fog is pretty thick, so we can all be forgiven for being a little confused from time to time as to what is true and what isn't. We know, for instance, that last night, perhaps as many as 100 missiles were fired by the Russian forces. At least 50 to 60 of them penetrated Ukrainian air defenses and wiped out another substantial portion of the Ukrainian power grid. In fact, today, a spokesman for Zelensky pointed out that unless there are serious attempts made to prepare for the winter and improve the situation in Western Ukraine, they may have to evacuate whole cities where there is no power. The country is literally operating in the dark. So this doesn't bode well for Ukraine. At the same time, almost completely unrelated to this reality of Ukraine's descent into chaos because there is no energy, you have this strange announcement that we are suddenly sending, after 8 months of no accountability, a few hundred soldiers under a brigadier general into Ukraine with the mission of somehow or another tracking all of the equipment that's being sent. Well, we already know that large quantities of the equipment are being sold off to others around the world, including ISIS. What is this really all about? I mean, we've been at this for 8 months. We've spent $65 billion, and now suddenly we're worried about accountability. This is beginning to look a little like an advance party for this very dangerous proposition that a multinational coalition of the willing, a force of perhaps 50, 60, 70, 80,000 Western troops will eventually go into Western Ukraine. This was floated, as you know, a couple of weeks ago by General Retired Petraeus.
Right.
And people at the time tended to dismiss it. I said, no, you've got to take this very seriously. He wouldn't say it unless others had urged him to do so. So I think this may have something to do with it. We don't know how many Americans, contractors in uniform and so forth, are already in the country anyway. But if this is what I think it is, there's also another rumor floating around inside the Beltway. It hasn't been officially announced, but I think it may be, that we're actually talking about standing up a Russian government in exile. Now, if you're interested in coming to some sort of arrangements with Moscow,
wow.
First of all, don't put together a multinational force to intervene, because the Russians have already said, if you do this, we'll destroy it effectively. So if we go in there, we're going to be at war with Russia. Perhaps the multinational force is designed to try and drag NATO as an alliance into this war that the Europeans, frankly, would otherwise not want to fight. And the second thing is, if your purpose is not regime change, as stated by President Biden, why would anyone even consider the idea of setting up a Russian government in exile? If any of this is supposed to promote peace, understanding, whatever you want to call it, let alone an agreement with Russia, I'd say none of it works. It's a disaster.
Well, you have President Putin over the past 24 hours as well coming out and saying, look, we had a framework in place in Istanbul, right? That all got thrown in the trash at the moment that the UK and the United States basically threw in and said, no, we're no peace talks. So there's really nothing on the table at this hour, even though we keep hearing from Moscow that they would like to have discussions and they're open to it. But time is running out. And so I want to dive a little deeper into this advanced party idea, because as you said on our show a few weeks ago, once the ground freezes and once Russia is able to move its tanks and start this massive military operation of 300,000, 400,000 troops, it's game over. So what is the United States preparing or NATO forces an advance party? What exactly would that look like to you?
When we talk about an advance party in the military, any unit, before it moves into a quote unquote assembly area, before it goes to an area where it might fight, it sends a small number of officers and soldiers and non-commissioned officers to examine the area and look for good places to establish positions, good places to set up assembly areas. For instance, I was part of the advance party for the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment back in 1990 before we deployed to Saudi Arabia. I went down 2 weeks early with others, and we went into the desert and scouted the area and looked for places where we could set up. Ultimately, we used them. It doesn't take very many people to do that. The other problem with this 200 or 300 man contingent under the 1-star is, why would they need a 1-star? In fact, why would they need anybody in uniform at all? Most of the time, inspectors are in civilian clothes because they're designed not to alarm and provoke either the host country or potential opponents. So it's perfectly logical to say that these people are looking for areas where they could set up, where they can establish power, where they can fuel themselves, where they can sustain themselves, live. And I don't know what else you could point to, because the notion that they are going to track in an area the size of Texas all of the equipment, at least 40% of which is being sold off and sent to other countries, is absurd. I don't see it happening.
So some of the reports we're hearing, and you can confirm this on your side as well, is that Kherson specifically, there's a mounting of forces in that area. More evacuation orders have been ordered on the Russian side. Where do you think this advance party might find the most opportune place to set up? And ultimately, then what's the end game then? Is it the United States and NATO amass tens of thousands of forces in that area and move into the 4 annexed regions, the Donbass?
No, I don't think so. I think it's more likely that they'll stay west of the Dnieper River. And one of the points that's being made is that these forces, if they go in, will stay out of artillery range. The same thing is true for these inspectors, that they will not go forward where they might come under fire by Russian forces, that is, within artillery range. The problem with the notion of outside of artillery range is it excludes the tactical and theater ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, which the Russians have thousands of, carrying up to 1,000-pound conventional warheads, conventional explosives. These are pinpoint accurate in their destinations. So frankly, from the moment you step over the border from Poland into Ukraine, or over the border from Romania into Ukraine, you could be targeted. And we tend to forget that just as we have space-based and terrestrial intelligence gathering assets, in other words, satellites and unmanned systems, so do the Russians. The notion that you're going to fool anybody, sneak in over the night and set up somewhere in Western Ukraine with impunity is crazy. If we go into that country, we will come under fire. And frankly, if you're a Russian, you know this is quote unquote multinational, your first instinct is to destroy the U.S. forces, who are ultimately leading it, who are the core element of the force, as well as U.S. command and control, which is effectively NATO command and control. NATO has no independent command and control, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, none of it. It's all dependent upon us. So this is an invitation to direct war with Russia.
It's unbelievable, because as we sit here, we're not hearing anything out of Washington about this. There's really no discussion at all about it. All we keep hearing in Pentagon briefings is these are the new advanced systems that we are sending to Ukraine, Vampire anti-drone systems. You've talked about a number of different specialty heavy weapons that you were talking about a few weeks ago. Now we're hearing that those are being ramped up to being moved into Ukraine as well. So we're not hearing anything from Washington about this. And what happens, Colonel, once American soldiers start arriving in coffins at Dover Air Force Base?
Well, it depends on your perspective. I think the assumption is potentially inside this administration that if they go into Western Ukraine and our forces do come under fire and American lives are lost, that there will be, quote unquote, a rally round the flag effect inside the United States, and everyone will clamor for war with Russia. It's happened before. I mean, if we go back to Pearl Harbor I mean, quite frankly, Pearl Harbor was something that everyone knew was inevitable as soon as the oil embargo was imposed on Japan. And the Japanese submitted 3 peace proposals, the last one in October of 1941 that met all of our demands, and we rejected all of it. So the Navy wanted to move the fleet out of Pearl Harbor, and FDR insisted that it stay there. Now, as a result, the United States, if you look at the polling data, which was overwhelmingly opposed to entrance into war in Europe, was then left with no choice, a fait accompli. But this is not Pearl Harbor. Western Ukraine is not Pearl Harbor. It is not part of the United States. It's not territory that we protect. It is not an extension of NATO. And so if we do this, I think they're making a mistake. I think a lot of people are going to be suspicious and say, well, wait a minute, what are we doing in Western Ukraine anyway? But I suspect they're betting that they might be able to get what they want, which is a direct military confrontation with Russia. And we haven't even talked about the nuclear dimension.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that side of this.
Yeah, because my fear has always been that there is no danger of the Russians employing nuclear weapons. They don't need them. This is something nobody understands anymore. We haven't really needed nuclear weapons on any battlefield in any military confrontation for decades, because we all have precision microcircuitry that guides all of these missiles and artillery rounds and everything else to the target. The reason we had nuclear weapons on the battlefield for many, many years for potential use was to ensure that if we launched at a target, it would be destroyed, because we didn't have to hit it per se. We could hit near it, and that would cause so much damage that you'd achieve your aim. That's gone. Neither we nor the Russians really need nuclear weapons. But my concern has always been that if we go into Western Ukraine and we take heavy casualties, and the Russians decide, well, that's the end of it, no more nonsense, and just roll us up. In other words, really roll right into contact with us and roll up to the border with Poland or Romania, that people in Washington will say, well, we have to use a nuclear weapon. Because if we don't, we will be seen as losing. Remember, every time that Stoltenberg has talked, he says, well, NATO cannot lose this war. If this war is lost and Ukraine does not prevail, that will be seen as a loss to NATO. Well, if you're going to take that position, then the nuclear option does loom in the background. Hopefully, there are people with common sense in Washington and understand that is not an option. Because the use of any nuclear weapon, if we say, well, this is a small nuclear weapon, that's okay to use. It's only 5 kilotons,
right?
Which is maybe half the damage of Hiroshima. That's okay to use that. We're insane, because the Russian will look at this and say, oh, they're using nuclear weapons, launch a first strike. No more nonsense. And suddenly we're staring into the abyss of nuclear winter and catastrophe.
What does a confrontation with Russia look like at this moment, and whether or not NATO forces are involved or not? We hear, I'm curious your assessment now of the 300,000 and these, arguably a few weeks away, maybe a few days away from ground freezing and this mobilization unfolding. And
I think that based upon the weather that I'm hearing from Ukraine, it may be another 2, 3, 4 weeks before it freezes thoroughly. So there may be a space there, and that's what worries me about this multinational force, that they may see this as an opportunity before the Russian offensives begin.
And we're hearing reports of a lot of mercenaries now on the battlefield on the Ukrainian side. Is that indicative of the fact that the Ukrainian army is all but destroyed?
Yeah, their manpower is almost exhausted. What's interesting to me is to hear people in NATO say, well, the Ukrainians have limitless manpower, as though every human being who is a man, and potentially even women, can somehow or another be dragooned into fighting. They've already got problems with desertion. They've got problems with people that refuse to fight. They've had units up and down the line in front of Kherson and all the way up to the Russian border saying, we're not going to attack anymore, because to attack these Russian defenses is suicidal. And indeed, they're correct, it is. So now you turn to mercenaries. We have a lot of Polish troops in Russia or Ukrainian uniform. We have some Romanians apparently now joining this. I think the latest count on ISIS fighters hired by the United States government to fight for Ukraine is about 70, maybe 80 by now. This is something that is beyond our imagination. And by the way, when people talk about the Russians, They don't understand something. Every Tsarist Russian army, and in fact the Soviet army, had large numbers of non-Slavs and non-Europeans in it, always. Large portions of historic Russian cavalry consisted of Mongolian, Tartar, Turkic troops. This is nothing new, and the Chechens have fought with the Russians as well as against them on many, many occasions. This is not new either. So it's a little different when you start talking about Ukrainians. This is a very different thing for Ukraine. Ukrainians historically have not imported anybody to fight for them, but of course they've taken serious losses.
When this mobilization happens in a few weeks, what do you anticipate will happen from the Russian side on the mobilization? I mean, I'm asking you.
The mobilization is already underway, but I mean, it's close to being over. In other words, the first 300,000 are largely showing up now in the support formations and in some of the combat formations that need to reach 100%, preferably 105 or 110% strength before you go into action. But the mobilization itself in Russia, I'm told, is not really being terminated. It quietly continues. And that's why I've told people that potentially by January, end of January, you could have as many as 1 million Russian troops in the field. Now, numbers do matter. They're not always decisive. But the other point is this business about equipment. The equipment that we're seeing show up right now is better than any of the equipment they've used to this point. In addition to that, they have inexhaustible quantities of equipment and of ammunition. I mean, pause and remember for a second, how many times did the Institute for the Study of War and all the other violently anti-Russian, pro-globalist, pro-neocon organizations tell us, oh, the Russians are running out of ammunition. The Russians are running out of missiles. The Russians can't do this much longer. It's always been wrong. Russia is prepared, and Russia can fight as long as it needs to sustain itself. Europe, on the other hand, is very different. They don't have the fuel. They don't have the power, the electricity. Just look at the diesel issue that you brought up the other day.
Right.
The diesel problem over there is acute, not in Russia, but in Ukraine and in Europe. So you start pushing forces into Western Ukraine. How long can you keep them moving? How do you ensure that they can be supplied and provided with transportation? More important, how do you replace your losses? I mean, the Russians have taken some losses. They're all replaced. But Ukrainian losses that are much higher, over 100,000 dead and perhaps 400,000 wounded, they've had a lot of trouble replacing them. And they're replacing them with reservists and what we would call National Guardsmen with very little military experience and background. But the Russians can do this. We cannot. So these are very important factors that should be considered. But in the White House, I think it's fantasy island. People are developing strategies and ideas in isolation from broader realities. Most important, once again, they're not listening to Putin. They're not listening to the Russians. You can't just go on ignoring what people tell you. They're serious. Take them seriously. And don't assume that because we're Americans and we cross into Ukraine, no one will shoot at us. That's absurd.
I'll get you out of here on this question, which is the midterm elections. Of course, in the United States happens next week. A lot shifts after these elections. We see major shifts in strategy and policy. We see the firing of people. Donald Rumsfeld, just one example. So what do you think will happen post midterms with this, with U.S. support for Ukraine?
Well, first of all, I'm one of those people who's very skeptical that we will see profound change after the midterms. I hope you're right, but I haven't seen much to give me faith in these so-called Republicans. I mean, once you get past Chip Roy in the House and past Rand Paul in the Senate, how many stalwarts do you have out there that will carry the fight forward?
Right.
Lots of things are being promised. We'll see how much is delivered. Now, having said that, the Democrats are clearly worried about losing control of Congress. And this is something that I've been concerned about, that there may be an incentive for the Democrats in their overwrought imaginations to launch this disastrous incursion into Western Ukraine before the elections, on the assumption that once we're in there, even if we do take casualties, and I think we would, and we lose people, the outcome is, well, we're stuck now. So you have to support us. It's the old adage, well, we got into there, even though we realize now it was probably a mistake, we have to fight this thing.
Right. Right. Don't vote for John Kerry. Vote for me. We're George W. Bush. We're the ones that got us into it. So you got to see us out of this mess. That's what I'm worried about, too. And we only have a few days left to find out what's going to happen there. Colonel, we really appreciate you joining us. Your insights are fantastic. And I encourage all of our viewers, we'll link up your articles. Your writing is equally as fantastic, and we cite it often here on the show. So thank you for what you're doing, being a clear-headed voice, trying to cut through this fog right now. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Clayton.
And he writes at the American Conservative. So thanks to Colonel MacGregor on that great piece. He's got a piece coming out tomorrow that we should all check out as well.